Dr. Austin Perlmutter, how are you doing today? It's so good to see you.
I'm doing well. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited for this conversation, and I'm just looking forward to an opportunity to talk about stuff that matters.
Ooh, I love that. I know that all of my ladies, all of my community are going to be so excited for this conversation. I think a lot of them are experiencing profound brain changes right now, and they want to know why and ultimately what they can do about it. And I am my demographic. The brain, in particular, is one of my biggest areas of focus for my life and my body and my health. As a mom to a young child who has a big business, I don't love it when I'm not firing on all cylinders. I really struggle with that. I love that we're going to be able to unpack that. But before we do, I want to just get into your why, your defining moment when you decided you're like, the brain is where I want to focus my energy and I want to help people thrive.
So I have a family history that is the reason why I decided to do this in two different ways. One is the positive way. My dad is a neurologist. His dad was a neurosurgeon. People in my family have just been obsessed with the brain for multi-generation. But the other side of this is I have lost two grandparents to Alzheimer's dementia. And I've obviously worked with a bunch of patients and families, people with Alzheimer's disease, depression, anxiety, other brain-related issues. And the bottom line is just we're doing, as a society, such a poor job in finding solutions for brain-related issues. And the reason for that is because we don't care about the brain until things go wrong. And it makes no sense. We have so much energy around preventing heart disease, which is great. I think heart disease matters a lot. But we have so little energy and so little consideration for what is prevention for the brain, not just for cognitive decline, but also for mood issues. And the fundamental precept behind all of this that I believe so strongly is that brain health is the only thing that matters. It is the final outcome. Everything else is a surrogate. And what I mean by that is pick anything that you care about in your life, whether it's healthy relationships, making a bunch of money, playing pickleball at a 4.0 level. I don't care. The only reason it matters is because it allows you to enjoy your life, show up and have a positive experience in the years that you exist on this planet. And that is, by definition, a brain health outcome. So without brain health, all the other stuff doesn't really matter. And there's just such a massive gap between the way that most people think about their brains and what the science is telling us we should be thinking about. So that's why I'm here. I'm fed up with the way that we currently look at this problem. I'm fascinated by the research that shows we can have better solutions. And I think it is the only problem that really matters at the end of the day.
Two things I want to say to one, even though we do have a lot of information about cardiovascular disease, I still feel like we're not doing the best job in that department. For as much information as we have, more women than men are going to have a heart attack and stroke, and the knowledge gap there is still really big. But more importantly, 66% of dementia patients are women. And I feel like we're failing them in that regard as well. And the second thing, and I would love for you to address that in a second. Second thing is I had two back-to-back concussions 2 years ago this last week. Well, they were 10 days apart. And I spiraled out of control. Ended up in the ER, had 2 weeks of migraines back to back, and ultimately got diagnosed with post-concussion syndrome. And I knew that I had a very small window of intervention to actually clean it up. And it was a very dark time for me. I couldn't drive a car. I couldn't get my son ready. And it was in that moment, like I've had health issues stuff before, but nothing like this. And it was in that dark night of the soul where I even wondered if I'd ever recovered, that I deeply realized how important the brain is. And ever since then, the brain has been my focal point in terms of how I take care of myself and really how I take care of my patients.
Can I speak to that for a second? Because what you brought up is so fundamental, so important. The way that people change behavior is through pain. Psychological pain is the only thing that really drives behavior. We want less psychological pain. And there's a huge difference between knowing things to be true because you're presented with data and feeling things to be true because you are motivated by an escape from pain. You're experiencing pain. Now, in my case, I experience psychological pain because I have seen family members basically lose themselves to Alzheimer's disease. I've experienced poor mental health, so I know what that feels like. And so I have the intrinsic knowledge of what it is to be in a state of worse brain health. And you've had that experience too, in terms of knowing that this is an unpleasant state to be constantly having headaches, to be maybe a little bit less than yourself because of what happened with the brain injury. And the goal for all of us, I think, in terms of education, is to help find better pathways so that all those people who are out there in the world who are listening, who are watching, can find their reasons why and try to extend outward those circles so that ideally we're not just waiting until things are so bad to where you have to get to the doctor because you need medication for your mental health issues or because you're so worried about your mother or your sister or yourself and dementia that you know something needs to be done, but rather to say, how do we get to the point of agency, of motivation, where we don't wait until there's so much pain and so much already pathology? And so what I'm trying to say with this is, whoever you are out there listening or watching, there is some reason why you care about this conversation. And that may be because you want to be present for your grandkids. It may be because you want to think clearer. It may be because you want to take steps to just be stronger and be more focused or whatever it might be. These are all brain related things. So we've got to transition from this reactive state of waiting until things get super bad to creating a positive energy from this place we are now and using that to leverage into a better preventive role for brain health. Because I agree with you. I mean, heart disease, cardiovascular disease, even though we know that we can prevent the majority of it with lifestyle, most people aren't preventing the majority of it. And why is that the case? It's because we have created a world in which the default options, the things that most people not only want to do or choose to do or like to do, but can do because it's what's available, are unhealthy, which is why we're seeing now that most Americans have one chronic disease, that about 40% of Americans have two or more chronic diseases. And not to say that we can prevent every case of dementia at all, but we know that at least 40% of dementia cases are preventable with lifestyle modification. And that's just what the peer-reviewed data is telling us now. It doesn't even get into pathways like inflammation and metabolism and what happens when we really go after those types of things. So I think the key here is to understand our own kind of brains in terms of what motivates us to change. And maybe it does require us to get a little bit angry about a scenario in which if we don't do anything, we're almost certainly going to wind up with some sort of brain dysfunction. And to get the excitement around, it doesn't have to be that way, that we can do something about it right now. So I think your story, it just speaks to something which is what I saw perpetually in the clinic, which is that people don't do much or care much about brain health until something goes wrong, either in their immediate circle or in themselves. And I think it's time to transition to a place of everyone taking agency for optimization, for improvement, for prevention, but finding your why as to why that matters is key.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I hit my head twice, at a time where I was in early peri. So I already started noticing some perimenopausal changes. And a lot of it's always, at least for my family, it's been brain related. So brain was already on and I want to loop back to this particular transition because this is where I really feel women begin to feel a shift in their brain. A lot of I would say the majority of perimenopausal symptoms, the most common ones are brain related: irritability, low stress tolerance, brain fog, lack of word recall, anxiety, depression, ADHD, mood swings, hot flashes, night sweats, sleep issues, all of that. All of it is brain issues. All of that. And so if we start to feel these subtle shifts in our brain, then it's usually late 30s, early 40s, mid 40s. I think what I'm asking from you is this is when we should listen.
Yes, and you should always listen. I guess
Always listen.
Let me nail this point one more time because I think it's key. So we can wait until things are problematic. We're having sleep issues, we're having mood issues, we're having psychological issues, otherwise trouble focusing, cognitive problems, and then say, okay, clearly something's going wrong with my brain. I need to do something about it. But what we don't talk about enough is in order to just go about our day to day, to do the basics, to go grocery shopping, to show up at your job, to engage in emotional connectivity with your friends and family, It's not as though your brain function is 10 out of 10 for 24 hours a day. It goes up, it comes down. It's, you get tired at the end of the day. If you were to give somebody a cognitive test at 10 p.m., they're not going to perform as well as if they were to do the test at 10 a.m., right? So the brain changes moment to moment each day, and it vacillates with things like metabolic rate and things like inflammatory load. And so sometimes these things will compound over decades, and it will increase and potentially cause a condition like Alzheimer's disease. But nobody wakes up with Alzheimer's disease. You don't go to sleep with clear-headed thinking, and then you wake up the next day with Alzheimer's disease. But we treat it as though that is the case. We say, nothing's wrong, nothing's wrong, nothing's wrong. Oh my God, I'm losing the keys and I can't remember my parents' names, right? And so I think that the point here being, if you're somebody out there and you are struggling with mental health, cognitive health, focus type stuff, yes, pay attention to that. But even if you're not quite there yet, pay attention to it, because the brain is another organ in the body. We need to dispel this myth that the brain operates separately from the rest of your body, because we're now understanding that conditions like type 2 diabetes, metabolic dysfunction, inflammatory activation throughout the body also program the brain for disease. And so those things that you're experiencing, the low energy and the like, yes, it could be a transient hormonal thing. So we certainly know that with changes in hormones come changes in cognitive state. And we certainly know that estrogen in particular drops off after menopause. And that may be one of the reasons why women postmenopausal are at higher risk of depression and dementia, because estrogen has a neurotrophic role, meaning it helps to regulate neuroplasticity and inflammation in the brain.
And energy metabolism.
Exactly. So the taking the step back here is to say, oh my gosh, moment to moment, my brain is changing depending on what happens in my environment. And at times it's so significant that we can't avoid that knowledge. I'm so tired, I have to go to sleep. Why? Well, just so happens that inflammation seems to trigger sleepiness in the brain. That's interesting. Or we say, oh, my energy level's so low, my fatigue is so just generally high during the day, I have to do something about this. Well, for example, inflammation may actually also link to fatigue during the day. Long COVID, one of the core pathologies is that people have trouble with their brain function. It turns out inflammation in the brain may be driving this, but regardless of the specifics of why a person starts to care about this question, it's either disease treatment on the extreme end, prevention ideally, but even optimization for anybody here when you work on these systems. And so just briefly, the three systems within the brain that I'm most focused on, and this will be, I guess, stuff that people in your audience maybe have heard of, in particular, the metabolic system, how energy, glucose, food that we eat translates into how our brain can use fuel and how that changes over our lifespan. But then the other two are neuroplasticity, how the brain rewires itself. And then the last one would be inflammation. So that's one in which maybe we can jump into in a little bit more detail, because many people are familiar with inflammation in the context of a swollen knee, so an arthritic knee, or maybe they have a mosquito bite and it gets swollen. But that same inflammatory system may be one of the best ways to understand where things go wrong with our brains and where things can go right. And I think this has a particular importance for middle-aged people. We can talk a little bit about this research, because the data show that there is this kind of window period in midlife, interestingly enough. Not, there's certainly all this.
Is it that interesting? I mean, I feel like it's very obvious.
It is obvious to people who have experienced the brain changes, but generally speaking, what neuroscience research focuses on is window periods in childhood, right? So we say before we're born up until around age 2, we're making about 1 million synapses per second. And then from age 2 to 10, we're doing all this pruning of the synapses. And then the prefrontal cortex matures at around age 25. And so that's the window where we're developing personality. That's the window where our brains are wiring for hopefully health. But to your point, people are now starting to appreciate that there are these other key windows for brain health over our lifespan. And in this recent publication, they were looking at the midlife brain. So what happens in the middle of our lives that can set up our brain trajectory for success or for issues? And the key system that they correlated with this midlife window was the immune system and inflammation. So all of this kind of centers on this idea that whether you're before you've had issues or whether you're experiencing issues or whether you're further down the line, the immune system and in particular inflammation is something that we can modify, and in doing so, enhance brain function right now and protect brain function for the decades to come.
No, I agree with you. And well, I want to connect the dots between the metabolic system and a decline in metabolic health and the upregulation of inflammation. To me, they are not separate.
They are not. And you're speaking to a very, I guess, new topic, which is a concept called immunometabolism. And it's, in essence, the intersection between the immune system and our metabolic health. So, just very briefly, when we think about metabolism, I think the easiest way to consider it, it's basically how our bodies utilize fuel that we consume from the outside world, so food, and convert it into energy and also into building blocks for our cells, and then get rid of the waste. And as it relates in particular to the brain, we've now understood that there are these correlations between metabolic dysfunction in the body and brain atrophy and dementia and depression. And so the most recent data show that about 88% of Americans have at least some aspect of metabolic dysfunction. And if you add in cardiometabolic, so heart-specific variables, it increases to over 90%. So the idea here is almost everyone has some aspect of metabolic dysfunction. And you can see this in the context of type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure or obesity, but we are not a metabolically healthy society. And so this is linked to specifically dementia, and we'll talk about why for just a moment. The data for the last decade or so, and Suzanne de Lamont was one of the first, along with Lisa Mosconi, to kind of postulate that there is this drop off in the brain's ability to use glucose as a fuel source as we get older, and that this correlates with dementia, specifically Alzheimer's dementia. And so what you can see in a brain is, as the years go on, even if the amount of glucose is the same, the brain just seems to have more trouble or just doesn't seem to want to prioritize using that glucose, using that fuel source. And so that drop off in use of glucose correlates with atrophy of the brain, shrinkage of the brain. It correlates with mild cognitive impairment, which is the precursor often to dementia, and it correlates with Alzheimer's disease. And so this decrease in the brain's glucose utilization, the technical term is cerebral hypometabolism. So the cerebrum of the brain not using as much glucose has been deemed a key target for intervention. It's one of the reasons why GLP-1s may show promise in prevention of dementia and potentially even in treatment of dementia. We don't know yet. The trials are still not done. But core point here being the brain seems to have more trouble using fuel as we get older, and this correlates with dementia in particular. So how does that then get us to this inflammatory conversation? Because it seems separate. So one of the reasons why metabolic dysfunction may drive inflammation in the body and the brain is that when our metabolic system is thrown off, in the case of, let's say, obesity, what you have is a buildup of inflammatory cells within our fat cells. So it's basically you have fat cells and then you have these macrophages, which are immune cells that kind of localize or hang out with the fat cells and produce inflammatory molecules that go to the brain and may promote depression, may promote dementia, all sorts of other brain-related issues. In addition, the context of metabolic dysfunction, which again, let's say type 2 diabetes is a prototypical state, is correlated with higher levels of inflammatory markers. And a number of reasons why this may be the case related to insulin signaling and glucose toxicity. But metabolic dysfunction seems to drive inflammation, and that inflammation correlates strongly with worse brain health. The opposite here seems to be true as well, which is that higher inflammation may actually damage metabolic health. So all of this gets us kind of to this question that most people will get to, which is to say, okay, I don't want metabolic dysfunction. I don't want inflammatory activation within my brain. What do I do about it? And the good news is it's really the same things that you do for both of those states of dysfunction in terms of lifestyle that has been most substantiated to help to bring immunometabolism, so the immune system and metabolic state, to a state of relative balance to protect our brains.
Mm. Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I've been looking at a lot of Dr. Mosconi's work, particularly women in midlife. I think particularly hormone shifts, whether it's puberty, postpartum, or perimenopause, we see a major, I call it a neuroendocrine transition. And so I feel like with lifestyle, if it wasn't dialed, it's almost like there's a fall off the cliff moment where we see a decline in metabolic health, but then also we start to see inflammation in the brain.
It is certainly a more rapid drop off. I think we've all kind of seen in people we know, if you're in the medical profession, how there can be for certain patients, you see them, they're doing well, the next day worse. And this can happen in rapid succession, or it can happen over the course of multiple visits. So in the case of Alzheimer's, right, there is this gradual progression, but there are certain times where you say, wow, that was a huge drop off. And that may be for a number of reasons. But what is really interesting to see is if you tether this to short-term data, then you can just see how powerful this stuff is in terms of influencing brain function and why it's this chronic exposure that leads to these issues. Because for most people and most of the time, if we're talking about Alzheimer's disease, what you're going to see is not a kind of a stepwise drop off, meaning they were doing really well today, and then in a week, they all of a sudden got much worse, and then in a week, they got all of a sudden much worse. That'd be something more akin to having a bunch of strokes, like a vascular dementia. But what you see is this slow decline over decades. However, the systems that seem to drive Alzheimer's disease can cause people to experience very rapid and short-term brain dysfunction, which is great evidence for the fact that when you leave these systems unchecked for too long, that's a huge problem. And so, as an example for the inflammation piece, I like people to think about the last time they were sick, and not just a little bit sniffly, but when they had the flu, when they had a cold, when they were in bed, when they were feeling really crummy. So most people will feel at least some degree of brain fog, of a bit of depressive symptoms, of a bit of social withdrawal when they get sick. And this has been deemed sickness behavior. There's a term for it because it's so reproducible. When we get sick, what does our body do? It tries to fight off the bug. And the way it does that is it ramps up inflammatory pathways. This is when inflammation is a good thing. We want inflammation to fight off bugs that are going to potentially kill us. But the effect of that on the brain is, again, social withdrawal, depressed symptoms, brain fog, maybe even impaired cognition. And the reason is because inflammation in the brain seems to create those problems in people. Now, that's a short-term effect, which we can actually observe directly if you were to take a molecule called lipopolysaccharide, it's a piece of a bacterium, and inject it into a person's bloodstream. I don't recommend you volunteer for these studies. They sound miserable, but people do volunteer, and they get this piece of a bacterium in their blood. And what does that do? It ramps up inflammation, and it causes them to feel depressed, not necessarily in weeks or months, but in
Immediately,
hours.
yeah.
And so that tells us that inflammation, when it's at a high level in the bloodstream, changes brain function, and it changes it in a negative way. So that is an acute effect of rapid levels of inflammation rising. But what happens when that inflammation is left chronic over decades? That's really what we're talking about in the context of this cognitive decline that seems to occur. And so there's a lot you can parse out in terms of the representation of a person's individual experience. And it isn't to say everything is inflammation. As we just discussed, estrogen here, which is a hormone, has multiple effects on the brain, not just in regulating inflammation, but it all does converge.
Yeah, I'm going to say it's an immune system modulator. And so, and particularly in the brain, we start to see inflammasomes increase as we start to see a decline in estrogen. So there's something to be said about, as estrogen declines, we do, depending on your lifestyle and if you metabolically healthy or not, which, by the time we are 45 years old, about 90% of women have one indication of that. And so I do think we start to see inflammation as estrogen begins to decline in an unhealthy body.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people are metabolically unhealthy, and I think there's really no way around that statistic. You could be the anomaly, and if so, great. But I think we start from the expectation that most of us have at least one aspect of metabolic health that we can work on. And I think it's similar with inflammation. I think it's clear that chronic inflammation is one of the core drivers of the top causes of death and disability around the world. What people don't really understand is those same pathways contribute to brain fog, poor mood, cognitive impairment. And so the moral of the story here is that this isn't just a certain people in certain places need to care about story. This is a whoever you are, these are the pathways that are changing your brain function, and you've got to be taking steps to modify them so they go the right direction, because if you don't, statistically, you're going to wind up in a spot you don't want to be.
Yeah. So I just want to really quickly summarize what you're saying here. And I think what has been a deep truth of mine for quite some time is that brain inflammation or inflammation in general can have an impact on cognitive function. And that it is not just potentially a person who is kind of stepping into cognitive decline or Alzheimer's or dementia. This is an everybody problem, and everybody, like all of us, need to be mindful and aware. And we all need to be thinking in a very proactive way to how do we reduce inflammation, but most importantly, how do we future proof our brain?
I think that makes total sense, and I'm on board with exactly the way you described it.
Okay, so let us roll it back in terms of what do we do? And I was talking to your dad a couple of years ago about the window of intervention. And I was like, I've got women who are struggling, all these brain symptoms, inflammation, and metabolic issues. So many of my patients have had prediabetes in their 40s. When is the window of intervention? And he's like, in utero.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. And I had just had my baby. I think I had interviewed him 3 weeks postpartum when I
Yep.
interviewed him last. And I thought about all the things I did to not only prime for my son, but during pregnancy and even postpartum. I remember my OBGYN thinking, like, I guess over 90% of women in their 40s will not pass the glucose tolerance test.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, this is what I do for a living. I'm going to pass this damn test. But I thought about your dad and I'm like, that can feel very hopeless. It can feel like there's a lot of education that we really need to begin to start, even for women who are pregnant.
You're right. I mean, there's lots to chat about there. My dad wrote a book called Raise a Smarter Child by Kindergarten. And so, like, I was the kid. So, like, there's not, at some point, you become part of the story yourself. And I think what you're describing here, same
You're the
thing.
super baby.
Well, I mean, I don't know if that necessarily was the way things panned out, but there was a lot of consideration around, like, here's what the data are telling us. Here's what ideally should happen. What I would say, and my dad would say this too, is the best time to start is yesterday, and the second best time to start is today. And so there's, what is the value of saying, well, this was a missed opportunity? Not a lot, but there is an incredible value in not waiting until tomorrow to start making these changes. So yes, we're learning a lot about how, whether epigenetically or immunologically or metabolically, mom's choices, even dad's choices, are going to influence the future brain of their children. And I think that the best thing a person can do right now is to start making some of these simple transitions towards a healthier lifestyle, because there will never be a better time to make those changes than today. So yes, it occurs across the lifespan. And yes, the key message here is right now is the best time to start.
I agree. Yeah, now is the new later. Okay, I want to focus on nutrition initially. When I eat, every day I eat, I always think about, is this going to fuel my future brain?
I like that a lot. A lot of reasons why nutrition is generally top of mind for people. One is people, are excited about their meals. They care about the food they eat. They like the idea that food can heal, that food is medicine. From a more scientific perspective, I guess, it is one, that food literally becomes your brain. Like your brain, just as every other part of your body, is literally built out of the nutrients that you consume. And we know that the brain disproportionately is comprised of fatty acids, specifically polyunsaturated fatty acids and omega-3s. So you can start making these connections and say, well, if we know the brain is made of those, don't we want to make sure we give the brain the best versions of those to make it function better? And yes, the data would support that consuming higher levels of foods that contain omega-3s is correlated with better brain health. So structurally, yes, we need the right type of foods, right type of nutrients to support good brain function. But then you can talk about how neurotransmitters are made out of the nutrients that we consume. So, for example, you need to consume tryptophan. Tryptophan is converted to serotonin. Serotonin is eventually converted into melatonin, but it has to come from your diet. And so making sure you're getting adequate levels of the precursors in the case of serotonin is important. Beyond this, when we think about these systems within the brain that we are just describing, metabolism, immunity, neuroplasticity, each of those is being modified in real time by the food that we eat, either because the food itself is going to be broken down into nutrients that go through the blood-brain barrier and influence brain structure and function, or because the food that we eat changes the gut microbiome, changes the gut immune system, and in doing so is going to influence these pathways that either through the vagus nerve or through the bloodstream will eventually impact the brain. So there's tons of kind of science behind why this is a true statement, but the statement itself is that diet is one of the most important levers for your future brain health. And so there's always the opportunity to, make that next meal a little bit better to support your brain function. And this isn't to say that every meal has to be perfect. That's insane. And nobody's going to be able to adhere to that. It'll probably have more fringe deficits in terms of creating unhealthy patterns of eating than anything else. But it is to say that you can treat your meal as an opportunity. We know that diet correlates with mental health, with cognitive health, with focus, and so much more. So the food we eat, yes, central to this story, lots of science behind it. And it is just such a great way to get into the conversation around how to start applying lifestyle medicine for brain health.
I love that. I agree with you wholeheartedly that when we're thinking about eating for our brain, it's about our microbiome. It's about balancing our blood glucose. It's about the building blocks that build neurotransmitters and builds the brain. That's always what I'm thinking about when I'm building the plate for my family. I'm thinking about my son's future brain always. And I always tell people that you need to just surrender to being in the kitchen more.
That's a reasonable thing to say. When 70+% of the foods and beverages in the grocery store in America contain added sugars, and that's everything from, salad dressing to bread, you recognize how much importance and value there is in having more control over what you're putting into your mouth. So I think you're right. It would be nice if we lived in a country where healthy foods were accessible, both financially and just more readily available. But that's not the country we live in right now. I should say in the United States, that's where I live, at least at the moment. So I think, you start from the perspective of saying, most Americans are eating junk food most of the time. I don't want to be like most Americans. I want to do things differently. And what an amazing place to gain some autonomy back over your diet as your kitchen, because you can actually parse out and say, this is a nutrient that is supporting my brain. So for me, if you were to go look in my kitchen, which is next door, what you would see is there's a lot of basic building blocks. There's a whole lot less of, bringing in processed foods. So we could run through what's in my fridge right now, but it's a lot of just kind of minimally processed foods that can be put together in a number of different ways. And, it does require a little bit more time. And I'm not always the best at the meal prep and everything else. But as long as you only populate your home or mostly populate your home with things that are good for you, your chances of eating things that are less good for you are much lower.
I agree with you. The other lever I want to focus on pulling in this conversation is going to be movement. I feel
Sure.
like that's the most compelling research right now is how movement can really impact the brain.
Sure.
I always say, you can't move your way out of a poor diet. So have that dialed. But man, movement, the research around resistance training and walking to me is very compelling.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get into that. And I'd love to also come back to diet a little bit because, as you may know, we've been doing some research at Big Bold Health on specific nutrients called polyphenols and their potential impact on brain function. But to go to the exercise piece, I think this is a great representation of what I mentioned earlier, which is so much focus has been on cardiovascular disease prevention, which again is great. But what do you hear about when you think about cardiovascular disease? You think about doing cardio, right? So cardio, aerobic conditioning, going for a jog, getting on the Stairmaster, doing these repeated movement exercises. Those are good things to do. But what we're now learning is for the brain in particular, that there is a subset of molecules called myokines. Myokines are molecules produced by our muscles when we exercise our muscles that get into our bloodstream. And some of these can pass the blood-brain barrier and impact brain metabolism, brain immunity, neuroplasticity. And so we're now seeing that these myokines, they have names like irisin, cathepsin B, BDNF, which is one people may be familiar with, that they can have a substantial impact on brain health, and that resistance training, which means weight training or anything that basically causes you to load your muscles with resistance, may be one of the best ways to produce these myokines. And so if you kind of follow this line of reasoning, you could ask, well, do people who do resistance training have better brain health? The answer seems to be yes. And then you say, well, is there some potential overt value to resistance training, even over aerobic conditioning. And there was a really interesting recent analysis that looked at all of these different studies on one specific myokine called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, probably the best known of all of the molecules that helps to boost brain function. And they found that resistance training, meaning weight type training, was the best form of exercise for increasing levels of BDNF. So then you take that one step further and you say, okay, so the goal is to load our muscles to produce these molecules to support brain health. Where are the biggest skeletal muscles in the body? And the answer is they're actually in your butt, they're in your legs. And so following this, it would be to say that we should not skip leg day. We should not skip weight training. So if you are going to be exercising, which I hope you are, or moving your body regularly, building in some form of resistance training, specifically that prioritizes your lower extremities, your legs, is an amazing way to benefit from this brand new research showing how when we load our muscles, we can actually promote brain health. So I think it's certainly a growing domain of research. It can quickly go to, well, how much protein should I be taking per kilogram or how much protein per pound? I think sometimes those conversations are helpful, sometimes they're not. But what is very clear is resistance training is good for basically everyone. So if that isn't part of your typical exercise routine, I think including, and it can be body weight exercising, bands, it doesn't have to be, heavy weights in the gym, but including some resistance training is a good idea for everyone, definitely for women, because this is something that historically has been seen as, well, that's not very womanly, or it's not something that women need to do. And it seems to be that the research is saying that's exactly the opposite of what is true.
Yeah, I agree. I wholeheartedly agree. I had 20 minutes today. It was resistance training. It was a little leg day. And even speaking to women, I mean, I know that to me, the brain seems to be one of the biggest areas of focus, but we're talking about 1 in 2 women experiencing an osteoporotic fracture later in life. That has a profound impact on the brain too. I mean, that all. And so, resistance training is one of the best things. That and jumping, like Dr. Von der Wright says, bashing your bones. But, I'm a big proponent of resistance training. But I love that more and more of this research is coming out, connecting the dots between resistance training and really moving your body and what it can do for the brain.
Yeah, well, it turns out that muscle, specifically skeletal muscle, is kind of a savings bank account for brain health. It's basically how it works. The more skeletal muscle you have, the more healthy skeletal muscle you have, really, but just generally muscle bulk, the more people seem to be protected against brain decline, which is really interesting. And there's surrogates to this. So one is doing a grip strength test. Grip strength is a very cheap way to get a sense as to what is your muscle health. And so the research would show that stronger grip strength actually predicts better cognitive and mental health. So this isn't to say that if your grip strength is weak, if you go strengthen your grip strength, then all of a sudden you're protected. It's saying that's a surrogate for, meaning it will tell you about whether or not, your muscle mass is where it should be. But the main point here being that if you build more skeletal muscle, it does seem like you are protected to some extent against brain-related issues. And the way that you build skeletal muscle is you do weight training and you make sure you're getting adequate protein and you make sure that your immune system is in a good shape, because it turns out that the immune system actually has a lot to do with the health of our muscle as it does with the health of our fat. So these are just general considerations. People hear about this stuff on social media and they say, oh, well, it sounds like I need to be taking all this protein. It sounds like I need to be doing this crazy exercise. That's not necessarily what I'm saying, but I am saying there is a reason why people are talking about it more that is based in good research. So it definitely is something that I think women in particular should really consider prioritizing. And last thing on that front, because there's been this kind of unhelpful discourse around, well, women should be doing more cardio or they shouldn't be doing weight training. I think that if you're starting the process, let's say, you're in your 40s, you're in your 50s, you're hearing this conversation, you've never lifted a weight in your life, don't go to the gym and throw a bunch of weight on the squat rack or try to do some deadlifts. That's the worst idea, because then you'll injure yourself and you're much better served doing lower weight so that you can build up muscle strength and not hurt yourself. I also think, I'd be curious your take on this, but if you've never done weight training before, I think starting with a personal trainer to just get you going so that you understand the machines and understand kind of the motions is really key so you don't develop bad habits.
Absolutely. Well, in bad form.
That's right.
Especially if you're getting started. My book's coming out and the beginner workout, because I know so many women, the gym is very foreign to them, or they hadn't ever lifted weights, or maybe outside of like just a workout class where it's maybe 3 pound weights or 5 pound weights. And so the beginning workout is body weight initially. And then I have an intermediate program where I walk you through tutorials for every single movement, but that intermediate program would ideally you have a personal trainer at least for a month just to show you how to have good form, how to hold these weights before you. Yeah, because injury is driving inflammation, and injury is going to keep you out of the gym for who knows how long.
That's right. I mean, the other fringe benefit here is one of the drivers of dementia and just generally worse brain health is TBI. And how does TBI happen? Well, if you're older, it's primarily from falls. And so how do you prevent falls? Well, a great way to do that is to go to the gym and work on stabilizing muscles. And I think that's just not thought about nearly enough. So like if you're building muscle and building stability with it, which you want to make sure you're balanced here and not just lifting weights for the sake of building up strong muscles so that you can look good at the bathing suit. By the way,
that is hard.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
So JJ Virgin, who I'm sure you know, talks about this often, how there's this gross misconception, which is if you lift weights, then you're going to get shredded and bulky. And she's like, look, that is so hard to do. And if that was the case, then every guy out there would be absolutely shredded with big muscles because that's what many guys want. And clearly that's not the case.
Even men, that is so hard to do.
It's really hard.
Let alone women. Yeah. I mean, I've been in the gym 4 to 5 days a week, every day this year, really consistent, building to hypertrophy, like very focused on my plan. And I've gained muscle, absolutely. But it was hard earned. It's been hard earned.
That's it. And I don't want to disincentivize people because it's not like you have to gain 20 pounds lean muscle. Going to the gym, doing the muscles, and especially you're going to come home and you're going to say, oh my gosh, I'm so sore from even doing these basic things. Great. That is a signal your body is changing and you're doing something new. So I guess I will highlight this point because I know in many conversations with JJ and hearing her messaging, I know it is a concern for many women. You're not going to get bulky and shredded for lifting a couple of weights in the gym. It's not that easy, and it's also just not something that typically happens. So I think just to dispel that myth right off the bat, if it was that easy, every guy you see would just be perpetually in amazing shape and look like they have 0% body fat. But there's a reason that's not the case.
We're going to be getting close. I got to go pick up my son from farm camp to talk about, he's literally cultivating brain loving foods right now. That's what I have him doing this summer. But I want to spend a little bit of time on the polyphenols. I'm thinking about my son literally cultivating polyphenols as we speak, but I want to touch upon that. And then I want to guide everyone to where we can find you. Cause I know that there's so many other ways that we can reduce inflammation that we didn't get into.
Sure. Well, I really appreciate that. So I'm a huge proponent of finding simple ways to make health accessible to more people. So generally speaking, I kind of look at the biohacking and wellness space as some percentage of it is useful, some percentage of it is true, and some percentage of it is neither of those things. And unfortunately, more and more tends to be sensationalized and not super helpful. But one of the things that we are seeing is that when we look at what food is capable of doing for our health, there's very clear research showing that people who eat certain diets live longer, are healthier, have better immune systems, and better metabolic function. And the question has been why? And so generally, the supplement industry has sought to kind of strip down foods into their constituent elements. It's basically a processing of the nutrients from the food to say, look, the goal is to take this many milligrams of X, Y, or Z, and then you get the benefit of the food without eating the food. But there's something intrinsically lost in the process. And it's the same thing that's lost with the ultra processing of food, which is that it is a compilation, it is an orchestra of data. Right. And some of that data is the microbes that live on the food. And some of that data is actually the nutrients that we have historically written off as irrelevant. So if you think about food, the first level of consideration is the calorie. And some people are still stuck there. It's all about the calorie. Less calories, you lose weight. Don't worry about anything else. Next level is the macros, the fats, the carbs, the proteins. And even though there is only 3 macronutrients, I think there's 1,000 different ways in which people say, now I've gotten it right. It's no carb, it's some carb, it's high protein, it's low protein. So people debate over that all day long. And then it's the micronutrients, vitamins and minerals. And that conversation derived from the understanding that you can be deficient. So if you're vitamin C deficient, you get scurvy. Nobody wants to have scurvy. So we say you need enough vitamin C. Similarly, we say, well, you need adequate levels of zinc, you need adequate levels of magnesium. Fine. But the next level to this conversation is the understanding that in foods that we consume, there are 8,000 plus of these molecules called polyphenols. And polyphenols give plants their colors. They give food their bitterness taste. So coffee, tea, chocolate, dark chocolate, what you're tasting, that bitterness is actually polyphenols. And polyphenols have been historically thought of as antioxidants. So we say, well, you want more of those. But unfortunately, the data around antioxidants as just generally preventing oxidative stress and creating health have not panned out. If you give a person high levels of vitamins designed to be antioxidants, they may in fact have worse health outcomes. So why is it that people around the world in blue zones who consume high levels of polyphenols tend to live longer and have better health? That's kind of the question that I've been trying to answer along with the team at Big Bold Health. And we've been focused on a food called Himalayan Tartary Buckwheat, which is interesting in that it's been consumed for 4,000 or so years, but has been phased out in many places in favor of corn, wheat, soy, and rice, which are the majority of the calories consumed by people around the world. But Tartary buckwheat is a bit bitter, and the reason for that is because it is the highest concentration of polyphenol, specifically rutin, of any food on earth. So with all of that as preamble, what's super exciting about this is we published a study last year in Frontiers in Nutrition looking at the polyphenols in Himalayan Tartary buckwheat on human longevity, on metabolism, on immune-related pathways, showing some of the, I think, first data ever with how these polyphenols can influence pathways related to longevity. So in a subset of people, we saw a 47% decrease rate of aging. We also saw changes in metabolic and immune pathways. And so why I bring all of this up is I think, certainly all these basics to lifestyle are essential. We're learning now, though, there's reason behind it all. It's not simply that, oh, well, you eat healthy food, and as long as you're getting your calories and vitamins and minerals, that's all there is to worry about. There is actual information, data, magic in real food. It is why cultures throughout the world who are the longest lived are cultures that prioritize real food. These are not necessarily cultures where they go to the gym for an hour a day, or where they take a whole bunch of supplements, or where they are trying to do X number of minutes of mindfulness a day. These things are baked into the actual framework of what these cultures have been doing historically. So we have to try to figure out how, as a Western society, a society where we're online, where we're participating in these a discourse like this one, how do we get the biggest benefit from what we do know? And so polyphenols are a part of this conversation. And I think it's just testament to where we're going with this movement of food as medicine. And it's a reason why we have to perpetually be asking ourselves, what are we losing in the process of trying to just pull out, the best of in the whole biohacking space or the whole wellness space, and recognize that nature has done things that we still don't know how to replicate, and try to stick close to that when we can in order to get the biggest benefit.
I love that. Thank you so much, Austin, for breaking that down. I absolutely agree with you. I do have to, I'm going to go run. I'm going to be a little late to pick up my little boy, but I want to share where to find you. I know austinperlmutter.com, and we can find you on Insta. Anywhere else you want us to go? You do have a free guide here on how to prevent dementia.
Sure. Yeah. Places to find me. So you mentioned my website. Dr. Austin Perlmutter is my social media. Big Bold Health is the company I'm working with as the chief science officer on this polyphenol research. So you can find bigboldhealth.com and the social at Big Bold Health. The latest project we didn't talk about, but that I'm involved in, is trying to find better solutions for clean indoor air. So Licehn Air is that company, LICHENAAR.com. Otherwise, you can find me at conferences. If people come to conferences, come up, say hi, say you saw me on this podcast. And I'd love to see them there.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for watching. Now, if you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you are ready to learn more about perimenopause and how to navigate with a lot of ease and grace, be sure to subscribe to this channel so that you can join our community. Don't forget to share this video with someone that you love, that you know is navigating the perimenopause journey as well, because they deserve to feel their best too. See you in the next video.